All right, class, 4.7, part 2, going to work out these examples. So if you want, I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and work out all these examples and then watch the video for the answers. So you can just pause and work those out, and then just rewatch for our answers. So we're trying to find the value of x. If we look at this first example, we know that we have all three sides have a length of 10, so all three sides are congruent. And because of those corollaries of the base angles and corollary of converse of base angles, we know that when we have an equilateral triangle, we know it's also an equiangular triangle. So all three angles are congruent. And if we know that all three angles are congruent, they all have to add up to 180. So if we divide that by 3, we know every angle has to be 60 degrees. So 5x equals 60 divided by 5. And we know x equals 12. Our second example, we can see that angle x and angle z are congruent. So that tells me that we're going to be using the converse of base angles theorem, where we know these two angles, so we would know their corresponding sides are also going to be congruent. Now, one thing to note with base angles, where these congruent angles or congruent sides, the angles do not have to be on the bottom. I can turn a triangle whatever way I want. I could turn it so that the side with 15 is on the bottom, and x and z are still going to be congruent. I can still call that, my base angles theorem to get those sides marked congruent. So I know 15 equals 4x plus 3. And I can just solve for x. So subtract 3 on both sides. And divide by 4. So x equals 3. On our next example, so see here we've got our two angles that are congruent on the left-hand side. They're not even on the bottom. It doesn't matter where they're at. Just noticing that we have two angles that are congruent, or two sides that are congruent. So since we've got the two angles, we're going to use the converse of the base angles theorem. And we can see that we've got an isosceles triangle then. And 28 equals 9x minus 8. So I want to work to get x by itself. (36) equals 9x, divide by 9. So x equals 4. And our next one, we have isosceles triangle again. We've got the two congruent sides. So that tells us with the base angles theorem that we're going to have two congruent angles. Now remember, the angles that are congruent are not the ones that are in between the two sides. 40 degrees is in between the two sides, so it is not that one. We're talking about angle F and angle D. Well, we don't know what angle F is, but we know that our third angle, or our other angle, is 40 degrees, and we've got 11x minus 18. So we can subtract 40 from 180. If we subtract 40 from 180, we get 140, and we know that those two angles that are congruent have to add up to 140. And if they're the same, then I can just divide 140 by 2. So 140 divided by 2 gives me 70. I know each of those angles has to be 70 degrees. If it's 70 degrees, then I know 70 equals 11x minus 18. And I can solve for x now. So add 18 on both sides. And we get x equals 8. So definitely on problems like this, don't just get caught up saying, oh, here's the two angles I'm given, 40 and 11x minus 18. They must be the ones that are equal. You really need to look at where are my congruent sides and where should my congruent angles be. Notice 40 is the included angle between those sides, so it is not one that is congruent. All right, now we need to find the values of x and y. So looking at our first triangle here, we see it's an isosceles triangle. We've got two congruent sides marked. So that tells me that these two angles are going to be congruent. Notice my y is not part of those congruent angles. But I can use my knowledge of those being congruent to help me solve for x. So I know 3x plus 8 equals 53. Subtract 8 on both sides. And get 3x equals 45. Divide by 3. X equals 15. Now, how can we get that 8y, or figure out the y from 8y plus 10? So we know each of these that are congruent are both 53, so we can subtract that from 180. Take 180 minus 53 minus 53, or add those together and just subtract 106. But you're subtracting both of those angles either way. And we get 74. So 8y plus 10 has to equal 74. So I know that's going to be 74, and I can solve for y. Subtract 10 on both sides. 8y equals 64, divide by 8. And y equals 8. Looking at our next triangle, again we have an isosceles triangle, two sides that are marked congruent. So think about which two angles need to be congruent. Remember, not the one that's in between those two sides. So it's the two that are on top this time. So our two y's. So I know that 6y minus 5 equals 10y minus 41. And I'm going to start with my y's because I can solve for that pretty easily. And I need to know what these are, what these angles are, to be able to find x. So I need to solve for y first in this case. I will subtract by 6y on both sides and add 41 to both sides. So 10y minus 6y gives me 4y, and negative 5 plus 41, or 41 minus 5, will give me 36. So then divide by 4, and y equals 9. Now we can take 9, plug it back in, and find those angles. So take 9, plug it in for y, 90 minus 41 gives me 49. So I know these two angles are 49 degrees. Now that I know two of my angles, I can find my third because I know all three angles in a triangle add up to 180. So I can just subtract those. 180 minus 49, or minus 98. And we get 82. So 12x plus 22 equals 82. Then we can solve for x. X equals 60 divided by 12, and x equals 5. All right, we've got one last example. We can see that we have two angles congruent. So that tells me that two sides are going to be congruent. And to pick out which sides, it's going to be not, so our 7-foot side here on the bottom is in between those two angles, so it's not one, or that is not one of the two sides. So it has to be the other two. So 2x minus 1 equals x plus 4. And specifically for this one, we want to find the perimeter. So not just solve for x, but find the perimeter on this one also. So 2x minus 1 equals x plus 4, and we'll solve for x. Subtract x on both sides. Gives me x. Add 1 on both sides. So I know x equals 5, and I'll plug that back into each of them. 5 plus 4 is 9. We're going to get the same thing here. 5 times 2 is 10, minus 1 is 9. So that's 9 feet. That one's 9 feet and 7 feet. 9 plus 7 give us 25 feet. So our perimeter was 25 feet. All right, hope you did good on those examples. Make sure you do the 4.7 homework.